A game for everyone is a game for no one. Upon first glance, this quote by Arrowhead Game Studios might not make a lot of sense. Isn't the whole appeal of most games is that anyone can sit down and play them? The answer is a resounding kind of. Every memorable game has to make choices. It decides what aspects to prioritize, which kind of audience it's trying to appeal to, and what kind of experience it's trying to create for that player. But when a game tries to appeal to everyone at once, these choices start to disappear. The friction gets removed, and as a result, the overall experience gets flattened. And to be clear, what you're left with isn't usually a bad game by any means. It's a fine enough game, a completely competent one. A game that by all definitions works, but doesn't generally linger in your mind after you've finished it. It's the microwave TV dinner of video games. These kinds of extremely safe mass appeal games are the ones that you enjoy once on release and are eventually forgotten. And this doesn't mean that they're bad, it just means that they're fantastically unremarkable. In contrast, some of the most beloved, unique, or influential games of all time are very explicitly not for everyone. They're confusing, they're demanding, and at times they're straight up unfun. But more importantly, these games understand something critical: the fact that they're almost certainly going to alienate some players. Having a specific creative vision generally results in a more niche game, and so oftentimes when making a game for everyone, what that ends up meaning is that it's scientifically engineered to appeal to the widest possible audience. More and more in many modern games, we've seen a trend of dumbing down mechanics in the name of streamlining the experience and holding the player's hand every step of the way to avoid anyone getting lost or the game seeming unapproachable. These trends of making the game as easy to pick up and play as humanly possible might sound good in theory, but in doing so, they often strip away any qualities that make them a memorable experience. This all gets even more complicated when you try and factor in difficulty, but we'll get there shortly. With all of that in mind, let's talk about the problems with making a game for everyone. So before we go any further, what exactly classifies a game for everyone? Well, back in my day, E for everyone was a rating on the box that you didn't bother to look at, so you played spooky body horror games at like 10 years old. Anecdotes aside, games for everyone in this context isn't about accessibility. Allowing anyone to sit down and play video games is widely regarded as a good thing, unless you're the people that get in my ranked games.
No! I like 3 winning lanes! Like, dude, do you not listen to anything I say? Man, fuck!
Games for everyone in this context is a design philosophy, one that prioritizes mass appeal and simplification over a more intentionally crafted experience. You can spot a game like this by looking for some common shared features. These usually include, but are not limited to, flexible or adaptive difficulty systems, mechanics or design choices that rarely punish failure, progression systems that try to support every approach equally but leave each kind of lacking, and arbitrary choices that almost never lock you out of content. But maybe the biggest and most egregious issue is the constant and excessive handholding, things like aggressively infaced quest markers, overly lengthy tutorial sections, glowing outline indicators on environment objects, and conspicuously placed yellow paint in the exact direction I'm supposed to go. And let me be clear that none of these are bad in a vacuum, but putting them all together generally results in the game feeling extremely lukewarm. Instead of trying to make a tightly designed, more deliberate experience, companies instead go the route of trying to push the least amount of people away. However, when a game bends over backwards to do everything well, it ends up doing nothing particularly well. And that's the big issue here. And taking a look at some of these ideas, we can see that some of the biggest and most successful AAA games of the last decade are modeled exactly like this. And in my opinion, one of the best examples that illustrates this kind of design in practice is none other than Fallout 4. The Fallout franchise has always been an RPG at its core. Since the beginning, how you built your character dramatically changed how the game would play out for you. The earlier games placed heavy emphasis on what skills, perks, and traits you picked for your character, as they dictated what options you had for progression, how your character interacted with the game world, and important to note here, what you were sometimes entirely locked out of. Maybe one game you decide to spec into a charisma build and smooth talk your way out of situations, or maybe say fuck that and spec into unarmed and retort every problem with the people's elbow. In addition to this, the dialogue was the main way you'd end up interacting with the game world. Oftentimes, these had many branching dialogue paths, so depending on what options you picked, each would lead to a different outcome, whether that be via skill check or unlocking additional information from just talking to the NPCs. The point is, these choices weren't just slight variations of the same experience, eventually funneling you down the same path no matter what you specialized in. They produced meaningfully different playthroughs, each having their own strengths, limitations, and outcomes. This context is important because Fallout 4 fundamentally changed how these choices are designed and ultimately how much they're allowed to matter in the actual game. On paper, Fallout 4 is still technically an RPG. You still pick stats and perks, and technically there's skill checks and dialogue, but all of that is really just to give the illusion that your choices matter. The perk and special systems of previous games have merged into one unholy clusterfuck that, unlike previous games, doesn't really change the gameplay. Instead of providing some kind of unique passive buff to change gameplay or enhance the role-playing aspect of the game, they mostly boil down to boring incremental stat boosts, which does work, but it isn't really interesting. This kind of oversimplification kind of removes the role-playing aspect from the role-playing game. Instead of having a character identity that feels unique, you can eventually just become a master at everything, and when everyone can become everything, no build feels distinct. This isn't necessarily a bad approach, but at the end of the day, being overpowered at everything just isn't that interesting. On top of this, the dialogue system of previous games was also removed in favor of a 4-option knockoff Mass Effect wheel. No matter what the conversation is, your options are always yes, no, sarcastic yes, or question. Previously, the games would have had exactly what each option would say along with the skill level needed to pass each check, but with 4 they stripped it down to vague summaries that don't always reflect what your character's going to say. But in the end, it doesn't actually make a difference anyway, because no matter what options you picked, due to the more simplified nature of the dialogue system, you'd end up at the same outcome regardless of your choice. Despite all of that, this approach obviously worked. Fallout 4 was a massive commercial success, selling more copies than the previous games. It introduced the series to a wider audience than before, and for a lot of people this was their first exposure to the series. The combat was polished, the voice cutscenes felt cinematic, and overall the game made the Wasteland far more approachable for new players just looking to sit down and do some post-apocalyptic adventuring. But in doing so, the game lost a lot of its identity. In a lot of ways, it became just like the other 69,000 looter shooters on the market. And let me reiterate that it wasn't necessarily a bad game, it was just a really shallow one mechanically and design-wise. It took the more simplified format that started with Skyrim and pushed it to the next extreme, and personally I think it made for a more boring game overall. These kinds of design choices aren't unique to just Bethesda games either. They're just one of the more obvious examples of a broader shift in how games are designed. Zooming out and looking at the industry as a whole, these trends of oversimplification of game mechanics and hand-holding in games can be seen in tons of modern examples. Games like Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, Uncharted, Horizon Forbidden West, Tomb Raider, and even my beloved Resident Evil 4 remake are guilty of at least some of these kinds of practices. There's lots of examples to pick out, most notably the highly controversial mustard yellow paint coating everything from climbing wall sequences to interactable environment objects or even the paths that you're supposed to go. However, there are other less than clever ways that developers disguise hand-holding gameplay, which include NPCs pointing out puzzle solutions before you've even started the puzzle.
Think you can uncover that geyser from here?
And scripted gameplay sequences that boil down to you holding up until you've made it to the next checkpoint to make you feel like you're doing something without really doing much. As well as constantly auto-saving at every turn so that dying or making bad choices are never permanent. Basically, developers need to make sure that the game is beatable by even the most seasoned of game journalists.
Of gameplay barricades are common and force you to restart and face your demons again and again and again.
And some of this stuff can be written off as quality of life changes or making the design of things more coherent. While that's true in some cases, these things largely act as ways to make sure that nobody gets stuck for too long. I'm all for trimming excess tedium in games or improving quality of life aspects so the game feels smoother to play, but that can be done in ways that aren't just essentially letting the game play itself. Basically guide the player to the goal rather than shoving them through it. At this point, you might be thinking, Meaty, these are really dumb things to get upset over, you stinky idiot, and yes, in the grand scheme of things, they're relatively minor grievances. However, it points to a larger trend of developers trying to baby-proof every aspect of their games in a way that just feels lazy and oftentimes immersion-breaking. The reason for this is simple. With a nearly infinite amount of games out there to play, many games live and die by how initially approachable they are. If a game is too difficult or confusing in the first hour, it might lead some players to shrug off the game and move on to the next one. And so all that time and money that you put into the game is wasted if the player won't see more than an hour of it. So as a result, developers try to remove whatever friction they can that prevents players from seeing a fail state. However, in doing so, they often eliminate meaningful friction altogether too, which has long-term consequences on how memorable your game is as a whole. While kind of a loosely defined term, friction is any element that purposefully pushes back against the player via mechanics or gameplay. It's the challenges that push the player to meet the game at its level. In essence, it's the game asking you to adapt to the moment-to-moment gameplay or learn game mechanics. And while difficulty is one aspect of friction, it's not the only one. Stuff like limited ammo or storage space in Resident Evil or stamina management in Dark Souls are good examples of a more organic implementation, which is a great segue to talk about difficulty in video games. Difficulty in video games is a really tricky thing to get right. When you think of the moments that you remember most vividly from games, chances are they weren't the parts where everything went nice and smooth. Those feelings and memories came from resistance or difficulty. The feeling of overcoming some difficult obstacle. In the early days of the NES, games needed to be difficult because they were shorter and generally lacked the ability to save. The difficulty extended the lifespan of the game. Games like Mega Man, Ninja Gaiden, Contra, most of these games would be considered extremely punishing by modern standards. The limited continues, harsh platforming and enemy placement, and just general bullshit design at times demanded mastery in order to play. Because success wasn't guaranteed, when you actually won it meant something. It was kind of like a personal victory in a way. And these are the memories that stuck with a lot of people. Over time, things changed. Now because of how generous saves, checkpoints, and hints are, failure if the player even sees a fail screen is a relatively minor setback. Again, this isn't inherently bad. I'm not some sociopath that wants to restart an entire game after dying to something stupid. But you need to strike a balance, because when failure carries no weight, success carries less weight too. If the player is never meaningfully challenged or pushed to adapt, the metaphorical climb to the end feels far less meaningful. While changes like these can make games easy to consume and get through, they're equally as easy to forget. Generally, changing the difficulty in the form of a slider nowadays does nothing but changes numeric values, health, damage numbers, etc. Which is kind of a band-aid solution that leads to your enemies feeling more or less spongy. It works, but it's not very organic. which is why the explosive rise of the Souls-like genre is so interesting to look at. These games succeeded because of their difficulty, not in spite of it. They're so influential in the games industry and culture as a whole because of the nature of their difficulty. That's why everything can be referred to as the Dark Souls of whatever, or why the answer to any problem is get good. Chicken Alfredo is the Dark Souls of pasta. I got fired from my job yesterday. Sounds like a skill diff, get good. You get the picture. These games refuse to hold your hand or over-explain themselves. Much like the games of old, they demand practice, memorization, and precise execution of gameplay. They're masters at creating tension by making the difficulty and subsequent failures so punishing. It's why the feeling of finding a bonfire after almost dying with 1,000,000 souls and no healing items is liberating. Because these aspects are so unforgiving at times, these victories feel earned, and subsequently why many moments from the games are etched into people's memories. Ask anyone about their first time beating Ornstein and Smo or Melania, I'm sure they'll remember it. I'm not saying that every game needs to be some obtuse, esoteric, uphill battle, nor am I saying that quality of life stuff like autosaves or hints are a bad thing. Sometimes I just want to play a game to relax and not have the experience akin to putting my balls in a hydraulic press. But the games that challenge me are the ones that I remember long after I've played them. The success of these is important because it proves that you don't need to completely remove friction or guide players every step of the way. You just need to commit to a vision. Sure, that vision might alienate some players, but in doing so, it becomes something memorable. So what's been the point of all of this yapping? Well, at a certain point, the discussion stops being about yellow paint or perk trees or difficulty sliders. It becomes about creative vision. Every memorable game is defined just as much by what it refuses to be as what it includes. So when a game is punishing or obtuse, or when it doesn't let you see all the content in one go, they're accepting that some people might not like that and stop playing. But by that same token, they're also committing to a vision or a specific creative identity. This identity is what makes the player engage with the game rather than just consume it. It builds tension and promotes actively playing the game rather than just mindlessly autopiloting through another hour of gameplay. Not everything needs to be brutally difficult or niche, but I think the ones that stick with us are almost never the ones that try and please everybody. Even games that are terribly bad can be remembered for being terribly bad. In fact, some of the biggest blunders in the gaming space are infamous for being awful, but making your game as generic and consumable as possible is what leads to a forgettable experience. So going back to that opening quote, I'm glad that not every game is for everyone. I prefer having those weird niche titles that are more of an acquired taste. The frustratingly difficult ones that make me want to pull my hair out. The ones that chose a direction and stuck to it. I might not have always enjoyed them, but I certainly remembered them. Thank you for watching, roll the outro. Hey there, thank you for watching my video and sticking around until the end here. If you enjoyed my rambling and you want to leave a like and subscribe to help out the video, I'd appreciate that a ton, but just watching until now really means the most. I'd like to hear your thoughts down below too. Do you agree with my ideas? If so, what was a game that was memorable to you because it wasn't for everybody? If you want to see more of my content, I'll have playlists in the end cards, was linked in the description down below, right above my socials. On that note, I wanted to personally thank all of you guys for the support that you showed me on the last video. It performed much better than I ever could have imagined, so thank you all for the support. Lastly, if you really like my content and you want to support me in what I do here, there's a Patreon link too where you can get your name in the credits, as well as early access to videos and periodic input on video ideas. But no pressure, I'm just happy that you watched this video. Speaking of patrons, a huge thank you to NDH for your support. You help me to continue to make these silly videos, and I appreciate that a lot. And thank you all once again for watching, have a good one, and I will see you next time.